To most people, the word finance conjures up a world of complicated, hard-to-understand terms. Derivatives, credit swaps, option trading. Enough to give you a headache just thinking about them. But stripped of the technical jargon, finance is actually quite simple. It's just another word for the circulation of credit and money. Together, they're the lifeblood of the economy, on which a country's prosperity depends. I'm a historian. My name is Philip Short, and I first came to Shanghai nearly 40 years ago, at a time when it was almost unimaginable that one day this city would become the financial center of the world's second largest economic power. Yet today, the dream has become reality. To me, as to most Westerners, the way Shanghai has spread its wings is simply astonishing. Shanghainese sometimes say that those wings are the two sides of the Huangpu River. So that's where I shall start looking for the keys to Shanghai's extraordinary transformation. The Bund extends from here about 1.5 kilometers to the south. Most of the Western buildings we see today have been rebuilt, some of them 2 or 3 times. But already at the end of the 19th century, the giants of Western finance were all here. The Oriental Bank from Britain, the Russo-Asiatic Bank, the Deutsche Asiatische Bank from Germany, Citibank from the United States, and the Yokohama Specie Bank. A number of insurance companies and of course the bank with the bronze lions, HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. To many Western businessmen, Shanghai was a place to make your fortune. Before 1869, it took 4 months, often longer, to come here by sea from Europe. To the east, Shanghai looks out over the immensity of the Pacific Ocean. To the north, south, and west are the teeming provinces of the Chinese interior. But that year, the Suez Canal opened. The travel time from Europe to Shanghai was cut to 6 weeks. Steamships replaced the clippers, carrying hundreds of times more cargo. By the end of the 19th century, submarine cables had been laid between London and Shanghai, and news could be sent by telegraph. With faster communications, trade expanded quickly, and capital, in other words finance, moved more quickly too. Huangpu Beach Road in the international settlement was home to more than 20 foreign banks and various joint stock companies. 4 others were Chinese. The Daqing Government Bank, which then served as the Imperial Treasury, was at number 50 Hankou Road. The presence of so many Western banks and companies laid the foundation for the modernization of the Chinese banking sector. But there were also more fundamental factors at work bringing change. As China entered the 20th century, revolution was in the air. A revolution in politics and society which for the first time in many hundreds of years would profoundly alter the way the country was ruled. On January the 1st, 1912, the Chinese Republic was proclaimed. 6 weeks later, the Qing Emperor abdicated. The political revolution had triumphed, but who would lead the financial revolution that was coming hard on its heels? In Shanghai, 4 men were at the forefront of the financial modernization drive. Jiang Jiao, Chen Yongming and Li Ming had studied in Japan. Chen Guangfu graduated from a famous American business school, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Jiang Jiao worked here in this building, the former headquarters of the Daqing Government Bank, which Sun Yat-sen, the Republic's first president, renamed the Bank of China shortly after the revolution. Today, it's not only the country's oldest bank, but also one of the biggest. Jiang and the other 3 returned students had no interest in working as compradors for foreign businesses. They wanted to create modern banks for Chinese customers. Since they couldn't compete directly with the foreign banks in their expensive offices on the Bund, they rented premises in the area just behind. This extended from Suzhou Creek in the north to what used to be the Yangjing Creek in the south, forming a 2 square kilometre block, which at the end of the 19th century was full of shops and go-downs and traditional Chinese banks. Native banks, as foreigners called them. The most innovative of the new foreign-style banks that the young Chinese returnees established was the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank, founded by Chen Guangfu in 1915. The building where the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank was founded is on the corner of Jiangxi and Ningbo Road, about 500 meters east of the Bund. But in 1915, the Bund was no longer what it was. Foreign companies had been hit hard by the European War, and many Western businessmen had gone home. Chen's bank prospered. Less competition meant more opportunities. The bank's central location also meant it was close to the many flour and textile mills and small workshops turning out food additives and pharmaceutical products that lined Suzhou Creek. Industry needs finance, and the foreign banks set very strict conditions for lending to Chinese companies. So Chen initiated a policy of granting loans to factory owners, using as collateral their machinery and equipment, finished goods and real estate assets. Western banks already did this for foreign companies, but Chen, for the first time, applied this to Chinese businesses. When Chen Guangfu established the Commercial and Savings Bank, Jiang Jiao was deputy manager of the Bank of China's Shanghai branch, working under Song Hun Jiang, who'd spent his early career as a comprador for foreign banks. That year, Jiang and the other bankers started organizing a daily bankers' luncheon, at which they exchanged information and discussed how to take advantage of the European war to expand Shanghai's banking sector. Such reflections were abruptly interrupted, however, when on May 13, 1916, the participants found themselves suddenly confronted by a much more serious issue. Let me explain. If you look at a banknote from that time, it says very clearly, payable to the bearer in silver dollars. In other words, anyone who possessed one could go to the bank to have it exchanged for silver, then the standard on which the Chinese currency was based. The trouble was, the Northern Warlord government had been recklessly printing money. It had issued more than $70 million in banknotes when there was only enough silver to back 20 million. So the Finance Ministry instructed the Bank of China and the Communications Bank to stop exchanging notes for silver, an order which the Communications Bank began implementing on May the 12th. The result, inevitably, was a bank run. Thousands of people descended on the Bank of China, demanding that their paper notes be converted into silver immediately. What was the Bank of China to do? Should it continue accepting its customers' banknotes and exchanging them for silver? Or should it obey the government's order as the Communications Bank had done? At stake was not only its reputation with its clients, but also its relationship with the warlord government in Beijing. Well, to cut a long story short, Jiang and Song decided to reject the ministry's instruction. These doors behind me were thrown open, the customers rushed in, and their notes were exchanged for silver. The incident became famous in China as the resistance to the government's suspension order. The Shanghai newspaper, the Shenbao, put out a special edition to announce the decision, reproducing a handwritten announcement from Jiang and Song, after which the bank run stopped. On the surface, it seemed to be just a matter of the bank protecting its customers' interests, but in fact, it was essentially political. The warlord government had lost all credibility. President Yuan Shikai had spent tens of millions of dollars trying to restore the monarchy with himself as emperor, only to be forced to back down when opposition proved too strong. Over the next few days, the Chinese and foreign banks in Shanghai banded together to provide emergency capital so that the Bank of China could meet its obligations, and the agitation ended. The resistance against the government's suspension order was the first time Chinese bankers had acted together as a group to maintain their own and the country's reputation for financial probity. After their act of defiance, the young bankers worked more closely together. And before long, they launched another initiative, the establishment of a professional body, which they achieved in July 1918 with the founding of the Shanghai Bankers Association. However, their problems were far from over. 9 years later, they would face an even greater challenge. The new nationalist government in Nanjing would start exerting pressure of an altogether different order. This time, how were they to resist? In 1925, China's first president, Sun Yat-sen, died in Beijing, leaving a political vacuum. Western diplomats reported that it would be filled by a new strongman, the commander of the Nationalist Army, Chiang Kai-shek. But few in the West or in China were aware that the new leader had a background in finance. In 1921, Chiang Kai-shek worked as a stockbroker in a building which used to stand on the corner just behind me. His financial career, though short, had important repercussions. 6 years later, when he formed his government in Nanjing, the reason that the northern expedition turned east instead of heading north to Beijing was in part financial. Political considerations aside, the nationalists wanted to get their hands on Shanghai's wealth and resources.
这个呢是上海证券物品交易所的早期的档案。证券物品交易所呢是1916年孙中山先生提议创办的。那么他创办这个交易所的目的呢，一方面就是为了筹集革命的经费，另外一方面呢也是考虑到要在上海设立金融中心的话呢。交易所是一个必不可少的金融机构。那么，但是交易所呢，它的筹建也遇到很多的困难，一直到1920年的时候才正式成立。蒋介石呢是参与了交易所的筹建工作，后来也成为了交易所的一名股票的经纪人。
Chiang was a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. He wasn't very good at stockbroking. In the winter of 1921, when the market crashed, he lost a lot of money. Now, it so happened that at that time, Sun Yat-sen was setting up his government in Guangdong to challenge the power of the northern warlords, and he was in dire need of experienced military commanders. So he asked Chiang to come south to join him. Equally important for China's political future, in Shanghai a few months earlier, the Chinese Communist Party had been founded. So as 1921 drew to a close, the two principal protagonists who would contend for power in China for most of the next 3 decades. Fast forward 5 years to the summer of 1926. The Nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party have joined together to launch the Northern Expedition. A military offensive to try to overthrow the northern warlord government in Beijing and reunify China under joint Kuomintang CCP rule. After the capture of Wuhan, the initial plan was to push on towards the north. But Chiang, now the Nationalist Army's commander-in-chief, insisted on keeping back part of his forces and marching instead on Shanghai. They took the city on March the 26th, 1927. It's not hard to understand why Chiang wanted Shanghai. It was the country's purse, its money box, and Chiang needed money to pay his armies and to finance his campaign to unify China. The people who controlled the purse strings were the bankers, tycoons and industrialists. And Chang's plan was to win over the leaders of the Bankers Association, who had considerable influence over the city's finances, in the belief that if he could get them on his side, the city's banks would have no choice but to cooperate with him too.
We'll go inside and have
Please,
a look.
I'd like to. I'd like to. Yeah. Oh gosh, this is impressive. And you say this was where Chiang Kai-shek sent his people to demand money for his army?
Yes, it was.
Did they bring with them some kind of letter of authority, something to tell the banks that they had to comply from Chiang Kai-shek?
Yes.
But they could have refused, no? I mean, after all, 10 years earlier, when the government told the banks that they should stop exchanging banknotes for silver, they said no. I mean, why not refuse this time?
But this time, that would have been very difficult.
You mean Chiang Kai-shek had too much power, too many guns,
Yes.
too much support behind him?
This is where the Banks Association used to meet. It's hardly changed. The only difference is that they used to have bronze plaque with the words financial center.
In the West, banking associations in the West are non-government, as you know. They're essentially organized by the private sector. Was it like that in Shanghai in the 20s?
It was. The association was responsible for developing banking regulations, looking after the interbank relations, and also guarding against a lot of financial risks, protecting the interests of banks, and representing the banking sector in talks with the government. Yeah.
So essentially a professional organization.
Yeah, it's very professional. Yeah.
Over the next month, the Bankers Association and the old-style traditional banks raised $6 million silver to support the Northern Expedition, on condition that Chiang agree to end the war as soon as possible. But as they soon found out, Chiang wanted more. The Nanjing government approved a compulsory bond issue, which the banks were obliged to purchase, the same method that the warlord government had used to extort funds a decade earlier. Like the warlords too, Chiang appropriated the city's customs duties and salt taxes to pay for his military expenditure. In Chiang Kai-shek's diaries, there are many references to his efforts to obtain money for the army, but very little about the methods he used. For that, we have to look at the records left by the bankers and industrialists who were at the receiving end of his fundraising campaigns. Take, for instance, the case of the industrialist Rung Zhongjing, which was typical of many others. Rung was president of the Nationwide Spinning and Weaving Works Association. He was a prominent owner of textile and flour mills. The nationalist government demanded that he buy 250,000 silver dollars worth of bonds. When he failed to raise the money, the authorities in his hometown, Wuxi, sealed up his residence and confiscated his property there. But they were unable to arrest him.
Fortunately, Mr. Long was sighting in his Shanghai residence in the Simo Road, now the North Sanxi Road. It belonged to the international settlement then, so the Kuomintang authorities had no right to arrest him and confiscate his properties, including this building, in the settlement without the permit by Shanghai Municipal Council.
Did he have to pay? After all that, did he have to pay the $250,000 for bonds?
Of course, he had to. He had no choice.
Could not refuse.
Of course.
The numbers which are entered in the lottery are put into 3 metal globes, and almost everyone enters the national lottery, which is almost as large.
After that, the nationalist government came up with another scheme, a lottery to finance the setting up of a Chinese national airline. It was announced with great pomp by the Deputy Treasury Secretary Jiang Shouyong. But it didn't raise enough money either. So then the government struck a deal with the banks. They were allowed to purchase government bonds at a discount and then sell them on at face value, making handsome profits. In return, the bankers did all they could to maximize government revenues. In 1928, the Northern Expedition resumed and triumphed. By 1930, China was unified once more, and the era of the warlords was over. The banking system that had been created in Shanghai now formed the core of a new national financial system serving the whole country, which initially consisted just of the main Shanghai banks, the Bank of China and the Communications Bank of China, Farmers Bank, and two non-bank financial institutions, the Central Trust of China and the Postal Savings and Remittances Bank. At the apex of the new structure, a new central bank was established to affirm the country's monetary independence, with its headquarters in the former Russo-Asiatic Bank building at number 15, the Bund. The events of the 1920s in Shanghai and the role of Chiang Kai-shek had a significant influence on the way China's financial system developed. But they're only part of the story. Equally important to the finance houses was the fact that as Chiang was consolidating his power in Nanjing, he broke relations with the communists, which would have much more far-reaching consequences. There were also external factors. After the First World War, the United States and Japan both became global players. The growing ties between Nanjing and Washington had financial implications. So did Japanese expansionism, which led to the invasion of Manchuria and eventually to the Pacific War. By comparison, the tribulations of a man like Jiang Jiao, whom the nationalists sent to work on the railways rather than using his talents as a banker, were of no consequence. Finance determines the fate of nations. What happens to an individual counts little in the greater scheme of things. In the early 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek was chairman of the military committee of the nationalist government. As well as overthrowing the northern warlords in Beijing, he had subdued those in the Central Plains, and he was now moving to encircle the Communists' Red Army in their central base area in Jiangxi. But not everything was going Chiang's way. After the September the 18th incident in 1931, Japan had occupied Manchuria. Then, 4 months later, Japan obtained the right to garrison its troops in Shanghai. The strain began to show. Photographs of Chiang at the time show him looking haggard, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. Above all, he needed money. The loss of the Northeast cost the nationalist government a quarter of its tax revenue at a time when military spending was growing very fast. The finance minister, T.V. Sung, tried to persuade Chiang to restrain the growth of the military budget. Chiang, who knew his power depended on the army, rejected his advice, and the dispute ended with Sung resigning in a huff. But having served as the Kuomintang's treasurer, he knew the organization's finances inside out, and he saw what the problem was. No matter what the government did, tax revenue could never keep up with the growth in military spending. The solution, he concluded, was for the government forcibly to take control of part of the national wealth and use it to plug the hole in the budget. The instruction to the banks to collect all the silver in circulation and issue dollars instead showed that Sung's proposal was being put into effect. Until 1933, China's currency was still based on silver. There were silver taels, and silver dollars was the principal medium for trade and financial transactions in China, and had been since medieval times or earlier. Paper money was used too, and had been since Song times, but it was also convertible to silver on demand. Silver was the key to the entire system. China's currency, in whatever form, was based on the silver standard. In the 1920s and early 30s, China was among only a handful of countries which still used the silver standard. Europe, America and Japan had switched to the gold standard late in the 19th century, followed by Mexico and India. The result was that China was excluded from the new mechanisms for international exchange, and it suffered significant losses in its foreign trade. By replacing taels and ingots with dollars, the government had gained control of China's silver reserves, but it still kept to the silver standard. So if a crisis hit the international financial markets, China would be on its own. The crisis was not long in coming.
Our dollar is now altogether too much influenced by the internal policies of other nations. Therefore, the United States must take firmly in its own hands the control of the gold value of our dollar.
In June 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt promulgated the Silver Purchase Act, which, like Chiang Kai-shek's decree 15 months before, called on the state to purchase all silver in circulation, but at far higher prices than were offered in China. Faced with the Great Depression, the collapse of American industry and massive unemployment, Roosevelt's aim was to devalue the dollar, set up a reserve of both gold and silver in a ratio of 3-to-1 to back the US currency, and so to reduce commodity prices, boost exports, and stimulate the economy. From an American standpoint, it made perfect sense, but not for China. The country's silver reserves were depleted as sellers sought higher prices abroad, while cheap American exports began to flood the Chinese market.
The Chinese Bankers Association appeals to you, Mr. President. Our great country is already suffering from a series of recent calamities and is now in danger of sinking further into economic depression. Desirous of further commercial ties with the great American people, we appeal to you to take steps to maintain the stability of the silver price and to prevent any drastic increase.
Whether Roosevelt ever read that appeal, we don't know. If he did, he ignored it. The Silver Purchase Act became law. At the same time, the Japanese, who were well established in Manchuria, openly encouraged the smuggling of silver in order to weaken the Chinese economy. This combination of external and internal factors, financial pressures from the United States and Japan, and the difficulty of financing military spending from tax revenue alone, convinced the nationalists the silver standard had to go. Already as early as 1932, Chiang Kai-shek had written in his diary, "Our defense capability is based on the economy. The creation of a unified currency system cannot be delayed. It shall be organized expeditiously." With Chiang's support, the new finance minister, Kung Xiangxi, and TV Sung, who'd become chairman of the Bank of China, proposed radical reforms. The silver standard would be abolished, and in its place a new paper currency to be known as legal tender would be issued. Meanwhile, the government's accumulated silver stocks would be sold in order, so the nationalists said, to set up a foreign currency reserve. In 1935, this silver vault was built by the Ministry of Finance with a claimed capacity of 250 million silver coins. But that year, the silver standard was abandoned, so it was used instead as a storeroom for the new legal tender notes. Like the silver dollars, they bore the portrait of Sun Yat-sen. 4 banks, the Bank of China, the Central Bank, the Communications Bank, and the Farmers Bank, had the right to issue the new currency, whose value depended not on silver, but on a basket of other currencies, as was the normal practice elsewhere. The reform was widely welcomed. Most Chinese felt anything was better than the chaotic currency system that had prevailed earlier. So the new legal tender caught on. People were glad to hold it, the economy began to improve, and 4 months later, in March 1936, the United States signaled that it was willing to compromise on the Silver Purchase Act. That message was conveyed through the US Consul General in Shanghai, Clarence Gauss, who told Chiang Kai-shek that he was welcome to send a delegation to Washington to discuss currency reform. Chiang named Chen Guangfu, the chairman of the Bankers Association, who set out on May the 18th. His negotiations with the US Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, led to an exchange of memoranda in which it was agreed that China's currency would not be tied to the US dollar or any other foreign currency, and that China, like the United States, would maintain a reserve composed of 3 parts gold to 1 part silver as backing for the banknotes it issued. In addition, the Americans agreed to buy 75 million ounces of Chinese silver and to take a further 50 million as collateral for a $20 million American loan. The silver was sent to the United States over an 8-month period from June 1936 to January 1937. An American magazine published photographs of Chinese porters in Shanghai carrying through the streets silver bars and boxes of silver marked Central Mint. In contrast, it noted to the practice in other countries where silver was transported in armored vehicles protected by military security. It was estimated, the magazine said, that 100 million silver dollars were held by Chinese officials and public figures. It wasn't entirely coincidence that the legal tender reform, which modernized the currency system that China had been using for centuries, occurred just before the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. It meant that the government could use the silver reserves to finance its military spending, which was all the more necessary because China at that time was fighting alone, without foreign support. But using reserves is risky. One of the few who saw that at the time was Zhu Qi, an official of the Nationalist Finance Ministry, who warned that abandoning the silver standard would bring large deficits, which the government would have no way of filling except by printing money. Over the next decade, as China was fighting for its survival, Zhu's words would prove prophetic. The history of the Bund is in a sense a history of facelifts. The buildings that the foreigners put up were originally quite simple, but then they were reconstructed and expanded to become a symbol of Western power, exuding strength and solidity and wealth. It came into its own as a financial center in the 1920s and 30s with the development of modern banking and the reforms of the early Republican period. But why did the banks choose Shanghai rather than somewhere else in Asia? And how did this exceptional concentration of property along the waterfront acquire its present form? In October 1929, the New York stock market crashed. Over the next 2 weeks, $30 billion in wealth was wiped out. That may not sound much in today's money, but in those days it was an unbelievable sum, equal to all the money America had spent fighting the First World War. It was the start of the Great Depression. Factories closed, banks failed, workers lost their jobs, the economies of America's trade partners foundered. But not China. Chinese and Western researchers agree that the economic crisis which started in the United States reached China relatively late and had only a modest impact. At first sight, that seems surprising. Scholars explain it on monetarist grounds. The Great Depression caused the price of silver to plummet. As we've seen, until 1935, China was one of the few countries, indeed the only major one, to use silver to guarantee its currency. When the silver price fell, the Chinese dollar was effectively devalued. Chinese goods became cheaper and more competitive, exports increased, and living standards improved. And there's anecdotal evidence to support that. This is an American newsreel of Shanghai in the 1930s. It depicts China as a happy, fun-loving place where people enjoyed themselves, while back home in the United States, times were hard and there wasn't much to smile about. By 1934, 38 Chinese banks had their headquarters in Shanghai, 80% of the total for the whole country. There were branch offices in every province, but it was in Shanghai that the key decisions were made. The interest rates fixed here were applied everywhere in China, and the exchange rates and the gold and silver price were taken as references all over the Far East. Financial institutions like to cluster together. Wall Street is just 500 meters long. The British Financial Centre, the City of London, only 1 square mile. Both of them insignificant compared to the great metropolises around them, yet they touch every nerve of the world economy. The Bund is also 1 mile long, a rectangular block of land intersected by shopping streets stretching eastward from the river. Yet in East Asia in the 1930s, it played a role within the region comparable to those of London and New York on a global scale. Of those 38 banks with headquarters in Shanghai, 16 had premises on the Bund or nearby. 3 of the Chinese banks, which formed the core of the Chinese banking system, the Central Bank, the Bank of China, and the Communications Bank of China, and 12 foreign banks, among them HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, the Chartered Bank of India, and the Yokohama Specie Bank from Japan. In Zhejiang Road, there were exchanges of different kinds and more banks and insurance companies. In Beijing Road, there were 8 more. In Ningbo Road, as well as the Shanghai Commercial and Savings Bank, there were 9 trust and investment companies and more than 40 traditional private banks. And on Tianjin Road, 10 more banks. Everything seemed to be going well. The new Chinese banks that had emerged as a consequence of the revolution which had overthrown the Qing dynasty had absorbed the experience of their foreign counterparts and were now competing with them on equal terms. But a Chinese proverb says, "Be vigilant in times of peace, for war will surely follow." As the banking sector developed, it had been clear for some time that a proper system was needed for assessing loans. Already in the 1920s, the Bankers Association had proposed the creation of a joint credit investigation agency to monitor investments and credit ratings. But it wasn't until June 1932 that the agency, which was named the Bankers Cooperative Credit Service, was finally established. To head it, the Bankers Association appointed Jiang Naiqi, the deputy manager of the Zhejiang Industrial Bank, whose first task was to deal with the consequences of a new outbreak of fighting between China and Japan. You were saying there was a library here you used to consult.
Yes, and the white one in 1932, it's just after the war. The war started, the anti-Japanese war started in the same year, but Shanghai was damaged by the bombing. And then the Chinese bankers worked together and they organized this credit service and they tried to loan to the people, loan to the businessmen, and then make the investigation to their credit.
So really two things, the Japanese attack and also the fact that Shanghai was becoming a bigger center for finance.
Yes, of course.
In the West at that time, credit ratings agencies adopted what they called the 3 C's standard: capital, capability, and character. The Bankers Cooperative Credit Service in Shanghai followed the same principle, and in fact it remains the basis of credit investigation and risk determination in China to this day. Jiang Naiqi used to say that credit was like a skittish horse which had to be carefully managed. On the one hand, without it, finance would be impossible. On the other, if credit were given without proper guarantees, it would result in a financial bubble and ultimately the collapse of the securities industry. Which of course is exactly what happened in the United States in 2008, when the subprime crisis caused a worldwide financial meltdown. So Jiang Naiqi's cautionary words from the 1930s remain as relevant now as they were then. Jiang's good sense was shown very soon afterwards when, in 1934, China's largest family-owned business, the Rung family group, found itself confronting a credit crisis. The Rung brothers, Rung Zongjing and Rung Desheng, from the town of Wuxi, had started out in business by establishing a small private bank. By the 1930s, they owned 21 flour mills and textile mills and were dubbed the Flour King and Textile King of China. You could find the Rung family's Fuxin and Shunxin factories all over Shanghai. At this point, Rung Zongjing started making large investments in industry using credits and loans from several of the biggest banks. As collateral, he offered the fixed assets and supplies of the textile and flour mills. That meant that if he failed to meet the repayment schedule, the banks could seize his mills. In 1934, Rung Zongjing's son suffered huge losses in cotton speculation. At the same time, demand for textiles fell as a result of the world recession. The capital chain on which the family was relying was in danger of breaking. That summer, the value of Rung's textile mills was estimated at about 69 million yuan, while the debts totaled nearly 64 million. In other words, they were very close to bankruptcy.
Rung think about suicide. Then the Song Han-zhang and the Chen Guangfu, the two top banks, stayed up the whole night with him and make sure he didn't kill himself.
Whether from friendship or in order to make money, in the end the Bankers Association agreed to bail him out. They organized a consortium led by the Bank of China to take the Shunxin factories into temporary receivership. The bankers advanced enough capital to enable the group to pay off its debts, supervised its day-to-day operations, and reformed the factory's management system to nurse them back to financial health. It took 2 years before the group was profitable again. In 1936, the international cotton market started to pick up and demand for textiles rebounded. The crisis finally passed, but it had been a close-run thing. During that time, the political situation had worsened. Jiang Naiqi had been arrested for his role in the anti-Japanese Salvation Front. He'd be remembered in China as one of the 7 gentlemen, the group of Shanghai intellectuals who urged Chiang Kai-shek to take a stand against Japanese aggression. As 1937 began, a new Bank of China building was rising on the Bund, a grandiose monument to Shanghai's role as a financial juggernaut. But before long, other factors would govern China's fate. The clouds of war were gathering. The storm was about to break.